I am not comfortable sitting next to this man. First class is for a certain caliber of person. He clearly doesn't belong here. You need to move him. Those racist words were spoken to a quiet passenger in a simple sweater. But what happened next exposed the most expensive discrimination case in aviation history. When a flight attendant actually tried to move him to accommodate the racist demand, and the captain publicly validated the humiliation, they had no idea they were targeting the CEO of the company that keeps their planes in the air. This man's technology powers their entire fleet. His contracts are worth $150 million, and his response didn't just destroy careers, it triggered federal investigations that transformed the entire airline industry. Watch until the end to see the moment this unworthy passenger reveals his true identity and delivers the most devastating corporate takedown ever captured at 30,000 feet.
I am not comfortable sitting next to this man. First class is for a certain caliber of person. He clearly doesn't belong here. You need to move him. Those words echoed through the first-class cabin of Atlantic Airways Flight 815, spoken by a man who had no idea he was about to destroy his own career while attacking the most powerful passenger on the plane. What happened next would expose the ugly reality of discrimination at 30,000 feet and prove that sometimes the person you underestimate the most is the one who controls your entire future. The scene unfolded in the pristine cabin of one of Atlantic Airways' flagship aircraft, where luxury and exclusivity were supposed to create an atmosphere of comfort and respect for all passengers. But comfort, it seemed, was about to become a very relative concept for some people on this flight. Mr. Julian Vance had settled quietly into Seat 2A, the coveted window seat in the front row of first class. His appearance was understated elegance at its finest, a simple but perfectly tailored dark sweater, quality leather shoes that spoke of success without shouting it, and the calm confidence of a man who belonged exactly where he was sitting. He had paid for this seat, just like he had paid for hundreds of flights before it, but today would be different from all the others. In the aisle seat directly beside him, 2B, sat Rick Preston, a man whose expensive suit couldn't hide the cheap character underneath. Rick, as he preferred to be called, was everything that gave successful people a bad name. Loud, entitled, and absolutely convinced that his perceived status gave him the right to control who shared his space. He was the kind of person who confused having money with having class, and who believed that his comfort was more important than anyone else's dignity. The irony of the situation was almost too perfect to believe. Here were two successful businessmen, both clearly prosperous enough to afford first-class tickets, but only one of them understood that true class comes from how you treat others, not from how loudly you can demand special treatment. Rick had been complaining from the moment he saw Julian take his seat, first in muttered comments to himself, then in increasingly bold statements to anyone within earshot. The sight of a black man in first class had apparently offended his sensibilities so deeply that he felt compelled to do something about it, never considering that his assumptions might be wrong or that his actions might have consequences.
Chloe, the young flight attendant who found herself caught in the middle of this brewing storm, represented everything that was wrong with how discrimination often gets enabled. She was new enough to be intimidated by aggressive passengers, inexperienced enough to mistake loudness for legitimacy, and unfortunately positioned to make decisions that would affect far more than just seat assignments. As Rick continued his demands for Julian's removal, gesturing dismissively as if the man beside him was somehow contaminating his first-class experience, He had no way of knowing that he was speaking to someone whose business relationship with Atlantic Airways was worth more than most people make in a lifetime. He couldn't have imagined that the quiet man in the simple sweater was responsible for the very technology that kept the plane safely in the air and on schedule. But Julian knew exactly who he was, and more importantly, he knew exactly what his options were. This wasn't just about a seat on an airplane anymore. This was about whether Atlantic Airways would continue to benefit from a partnership that had taken years to build and millions of dollars to develop. This was about whether a company that claimed to value all passengers equally would stand by those values when tested by one racist customer's complaints. The stage was set for a confrontation that would prove that some assumptions are not just wrong, but catastrophically expensive. If you've ever been judged by your appearance instead of your character, you know exactly how this feels. This story is about to expose something that happens more often than we'd like to admit, and the justice that's coming will restore your faith in karma. Hit that like button if you believe respect should never depend on race or appearance. Comment below if you've witnessed discrimination like this, and make sure to subscribe because what this man does next will leave you speechless. Trust me, you've never seen a plot twist quite like this one.
What happened next would prove that discrimination often finds its most willing accomplices in those who are supposed to protect passengers' rights. Instead of addressing Rick's blatantly racist demands or following proper protocol for handling discriminatory complaints, young flight attendant Chloe made a decision that would haunt her career. She turned away from the man making the complaint and faced Julian directly, her voice carrying the nervous energy of someone who was choosing the path of least resistance rather than the path of what was right. "Sir, perhaps you would be more comfortable in another seat," she asked, her tone suggesting that somehow Julian is the problem that needed to be solved. "We have one available in the last row of first class." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud, transforming a clear case of passenger misconduct into a situation where the victim of discrimination was being asked to accommodate the person attacking him. It was the kind of institutional enabling that allows racism to flourish in places where it should be immediately shut down. But someone else was listening to this conversation, and what she heard made her blood run cold. Maria Gonzalez, a senior flight attendant with 15 years of experience, was preparing the galley for takeoff when she overheard Chloe's request. As someone who had worked her way up through the ranks and understood both company policy and basic human decency, she recognized this moment as a massive breach of everything Atlantic Airways claimed to stand for. Maria's frown deepened as she realized that a junior employee was about to create a legal and public relations nightmare by validating a passenger's racist complaint. She had seen situations like this before, and she knew that once you start accommodating discrimination, you create a precedent that can destroy an airline's reputation and expose the company to serious federal civil rights violations. But Julian remained perfectly calm throughout this insulting exchange, his composure a stark contrast to Rick's agitated demands and Chloe's nervous fumbling. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet confidence of a man who was used to being in control of much more complex situations than airline seating disputes. "I'm perfectly comfortable in the seat I paid for, thank you," he said, his words polite but firm, delivered with the kind of unshakable dignity that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you're worth.
Rick's reaction was immediate and explosive. He scoffed with the entitled indignation of someone who couldn't believe his unreasonable demands weren't being instantly accommodated. "Paid for? I doubt it," he sneered, his voice dripping with the kind of casual racism that reveals years of unchecked prejudice. "Move him, or I'm filing a formal complaint against this airline." The threat was designed to intimidate Chloe into compliance, and it was working. The young flight attendant's eyes started nervously between Rick's aggressive posturing and Julian's calm refusal to be bullied. She was caught between doing what was right and doing what would avoid immediate conflict, and unfortunately, her inexperience was pushing her toward the easier but morally wrong choice. What Rick didn't realize was that his threat to file a complaint was about to become the least of Atlantic Airways' concerns.
The man he was so casually dismissing and demanding be moved had relationships with the airline that went far beyond a single first-class ticket. Julian's business dealings with Atlantic Airways represented partnerships worth more money than Rick would see in several lifetimes, and his influence in the aerospace industry could make or break an airline's technological future. Maria watched this scene unfold with growing alarm, knowing that she was witnessing the kind of situation that could end careers and cost companies millions of dollars in legal settlements and lost business. Her years of experience told her that Chloe was about to make a decision that would have consequences far beyond this single flight. Julian sat quietly in his seat, but his mind was already working through the implications of what was happening. This wasn't just about his personal comfort anymore. This was about whether Atlantic Airways would stand by its stated values of equal treatment and passenger dignity, or whether the airline would reveal itself to be the kind of company that accommodates racism when it comes from loud, demanding customers. The tension in the first-class cabin was building to a breaking point, and everyone involved was about to discover that some passenger complaints carry a much higher price tag than others.
But what nobody realized was that Julian was about to activate a response system that would cost Atlantic Airways more money than they could ever imagine. As Julian watched Chloe's resolve crumble under Rick's aggressive threats, he made a strategic decision that revealed the calculating mind of someone who had built a technology empire from the ground up. Instead of raising his voice or demanding to speak to a supervisor like most passengers would, he quietly reached for his smartphone and began implementing a plan that had been years in the making. With the practiced precision of a CEO who had navigated countless corporate crises, Julian opened his phone's screen recording function and positioned it to capture everything happening around him. But this wasn't just about documenting discrimination for a potential lawsuit. This was about gathering evidence that would be used to make decisions worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The phone in Julian's hands represented far more than a simple recording device. It was his direct line to a corporate empire that most people couldn't even imagine. His company, Zenith Dynamics, didn't just supply navigation software to Atlantic Airways. They provided the technological backbone that kept the entire airline operational, from flight management systems to passenger safety protocols. Julian's fingers moved quickly across his phone screen as he composed a message that would send shockwaves through executive boardrooms before the plane even left the gate. The text was addressed to someone listed simply as Chief of Staff, but the recipient was actually Dr. Patricia Chin, a former MIT professor who now managed operations for one of the most influential aerospace technology companies in the world. Activate Nightingale Protocol, Julian typed with the same calm precision he used when making decisions that affected thousands of employees. Those 22 words represented more than just an internal company communication. They were the equivalent of a financial nuclear weapon being armed and pointed directly at Atlantic Airways' future profitability. The Nightingale Protocol was Julian's personal creation, a contingency plan designed to protect his company from being associated with organizations that violated basic principles of human dignity and equal treatment. Miles away in Zenith Dynamics corporate headquarters, Dr. Chin felt her phone buzz with an alert that she hoped never to receive. The Nightingale Protocol activation meant that Julian was personally witnessing discrimination serious enough to threaten their business relationships, and her instructions were crystal clear. Immediately suspend all negotiations and prepare for a complete partnership review.
Within minutes of receiving Julian's message, Dr. Chen was on a secure conference call with Zenith's legal team, public relations department, and chief financial officer. They were discussing the immediate suspension of Project Ascension, a revolutionary flight management system that represented the future of commercial aviation and Atlantic Airways' most important technological upgrade in decades. Back on the plane, Julian continued to observe the situation with the analytical mind that had made him one of the most successful technology entrepreneurs of his generation. He was cataloging every moment of Chloe's failure to follow proper discrimination protocols, every instance of Rick's racist demands, and every second that Atlantic Airways was feeling to protect one of their passengers from harassment. But Julian wasn't just gathering evidence for personal vindication. He was building a case study that would be used to evaluate whether Atlantic Airways deserved to be a partner with a company that prided itself on innovation, integrity, and equal opportunity. The irony was staggering. The airline was about to lose their most valuable technology contract because they couldn't manage basic passenger relations in their own first-class cabin. The most devastating part of Julian's strategy was its quiet efficiency. While Rick continued his loud complaints and Chloe struggled with her decision, Julian was systematically dismantling Atlantic Airways' future prospects without raising his voice or making a single threat. He was simply documenting the truth and allowing the consequences to unfold naturally. As Julian put his phone back in his pocket, the evidence secure and the corporate machinery already in motion, he settled back into his seat with the satisfaction of someone who had just turned discrimination into the most expensive mistake Atlantic Airways would ever make. The plane hadn't even taken off yet, but the real journey was just beginning.
Right at that moment, the situation was about to spiral completely out of control, involving the one person who should have protected every passenger's dignity. Rick Preston, emboldened by what he perceived as Chloe's wavering resolve, decided to escalate his discriminatory demands to a level that would expose the true depth of his character. His voice rose with the theatrical confidence of someone who believed that making a bigger scene would force the airline staff to give him what he wanted. "This man is making me feel unsafe," Rick declared loudly, his words carrying across the first-class cabin with calculated precision. It was a masterful manipulation designed to weaponize the post-9/11 era's heightened security concerns against an innocent passenger whose only crime was existing while black in first class. The accusation was as dishonest as it was inflammatory. Julian had done absolutely nothing except sit quietly in his assigned seat, speak politely when addressed, and refuse to be bullied into giving up what he had legitimately paid for. But Rick understood that in the airline industry, any claim about passenger safety would trigger immediate and dramatic responses from crew members who were trained to prioritize security above all else. Chloe, now in full panic mode as other passengers began turning their attention to the commotion, made the decision that would define the rest of her short career with Atlantic Airways. Instead of following proper protocol for handling discriminatory complaints, instead of consulting with senior staff, and instead of recognizing Rick's obvious manipulation, she reached for the aircraft's internal phone and called the flight deck. "Captain, we have a situation in first class," she said, her voice trembling with the nervous energy of someone who was in way over her head. "A passenger is feeling unsafe and requesting that another passenger be moved to a different seat." What happened next would prove that sometimes the people in positions of ultimate authority make the worst decisions of all. Captain Robert Sullivan, a 20-year veteran of commercial aviation who should have known better, was focused entirely on maintaining Atlantic Airways' on-time departure record. He had bonuses tied to schedule performance, pressure from management to avoid delays, and a gate agent already asking about their departure status. So when Captain Sullivan emerged from the flight deck and surveyed the scene before him, he made the kind of snap judgment that destroys careers and costs companies millions of dollars. He saw Rick Preston, a white man in an expensive suit, clearly agitated and demanding action. He saw Julian Vance, a black man, sitting quietly, appearing calm and non-confrontational. And based on nothing more than his unconscious biases and desire to avoid a delay, Captain Sullivan made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life.
"Just move the gentleman to another seat to de-escalate," he told Chloe, his words loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "We need to depart on schedule." The impact of the captain's instruction was immediate and devastating. Every passenger within earshot now understood that Atlantic Airways' highest-ranking crew member had just validated a racist complaint. The captain of the aircraft had publicly declared that Julian should be moved to accommodate someone who was clearly making discriminatory demands. Julian felt the weight of that public humiliation settle over him like a heavy blanket. This wasn't just about a seat anymore. This was about being officially declared unworthy of equal treatment by the very person responsible for everyone's safety and dignity on this flight. The captain's words had transformed a private act of discrimination into a public validation of racism. Other first-class passengers began murmuring among themselves, some looking uncomfortable with what they were witnessing, others nodding in apparent agreement with the captain's decision. Julian could feel their eyes on him, could sense their judgment, could hear the whispered conversations that treated him like a problem to be solved rather than a customer to be respected. But what Captain Sullivan, Rick Preston, and young Chloe didn't realize was that they had just publicly humiliated the one person on that aircraft who had the power to ground their entire airline. They had validated discrimination against a man whose company's technology kept their planes in the air, whose contracts kept their airline profitable, and whose business relationships could make or break their careers. The captain's decision to prioritize schedule over dignity was about to become the most expensive 60 seconds in Atlantic Airways corporate history. If you've ever felt the sting of being publicly humiliated because of your race, you know exactly what Julian is going through right now. But trust me, what he's about to do will restore your faith in justice. Hit that like button if you believe no passenger should ever be treated this way. Comment "respect" if you think dignity should never be negotiable. And subscribe because this captain just made a decision that will destroy this airline's future. You won't want to miss the moment when this problem passenger reveals exactly who he is.
But just when it seemed like discrimination would triumph over dignity, someone with true integrity was about to change everything. As Chloe approached Julian's seat with the meek compliance of someone who had been ordered to enforce injustice, her hands literally trembling as she prepared to ask him to gather his belongings and move to the back of first class, Maria Gonzalez made a decision that would define not just her career, but her character for the rest of her life. The senior flight attendant had watched this entire shameful display unfold from the galley, her 15 years of experience telling her that she was witnessing something that violated every principle of professional aviation service and basic human decency. Maria had seen discrimination before, had watched inexperienced crew members make poor decisions under pressure, but she had never seen a captain actively validate racist demands in such a public and humiliating way. Maria stepped forward with the confidence of someone who knew that some battles are worth fighting regardless of the personal cost. Her voice cut through the tension in the cabin like a knife through silk, clear and unwavering, as she addressed the captain directly. "Captain Sullivan, with all due respect, this is against Atlantic Airways policy," she stated firmly, her words carrying the authority of someone who had memorized every regulation in the employee handbook and wasn't afraid to cite them. "Mr. Preston is the one causing a disturbance and making racist remarks. Mr. Vance has done nothing wrong. Removing him would be validating discrimination and exposing this airline to serious federal civil rights violations." The impact of Maria's intervention was immediate and profound.
Captain Sullivan, who had been so confident in his snap judgment just moments before, suddenly found himself face to face with a senior employee who was publicly challenging his decision. The captain's face flushed red as he realized that his attempt to quickly resolve the situation had instead created a much larger problem. Rick Preston's reaction was even more dramatic. His mouth fell open in shock and indignation as he sputtered, "How dare you accuse me of racism? I have every right to feel comfortable on this flight." But his protest rang hollow now that a professional crew member had called out his behavior for what it really was: textbook discrimination disguised as passenger safety concerns. Chloe stood frozen between Julian's seat and Maria's moral authority, suddenly understanding that she was caught in the middle of something much bigger than a simple seating dispute. The young flight attendant's eyes darted nervously between the captain who had given her orders and the senior colleague who was telling her those orders were wrong. But Maria wasn't finished. She had created what would later be remembered as the moral wall that changed the entire dynamic of the situation, and she was determined to make her position absolutely clear to everyone involved. "Captain, I've been with this airline for 15 years, and I've never seen such a blatant violation of our passenger rights policies," Maria continued, her voice steady, despite the fact that she was essentially calling out her captain in front of a cabin full of passengers. "Mr. Preston has his boarding pass, he's in his assigned seat, and he's done absolutely nothing to warrant being moved. The only disturbance on this aircraft is coming from Mr. Preston's discriminatory demands."
The other passengers in first class began to murmur among themselves as they watched this unprecedented confrontation unfold. Some nodded in agreement with Maria's courage, finally seeing the situation for what it really was. Others looked uncomfortable, unsure whether to support the captain's authority or the flight attendant's moral stand. Julian remained perfectly still throughout this exchange, but inside he felt a surge of gratitude and respect for Maria's courage. Here was someone who was willing to risk her job to defend a passenger she didn't even know, someone who understood that airline policies existed to protect people's dignity, not to enable discrimination. Captain Sullivan found himself in an impossible position. He had made his decision publicly, in front of passengers and crew, but now a senior employee was challenging that decision with policy citations and moral authority. If he backed down, he would look weak and indecisive. If he pressed forward, he would be explicitly ordering his crew to violate company policy and federal civil rights law. Rick Preston, sensing that his carefully orchestrated discrimination campaign was falling apart, became even more aggressive. "This is outrageous," he shouted, his voice carrying the desperation of someone who realized he was losing control of the narrative. "I'm a paying customer, and I have rights too. I shouldn't have to be subjected to this treatment." The irony of Rick's statement was lost on no one except himself. Here was a man claiming his rights were being violated while actively trying to violate someone else's rights, demanding special treatment while denying basic dignity to a fellow passenger. Maria looked directly at Rick with the kind of steady gaze that comes from years of dealing with difficult passengers. "Mr. Preston, your rights as a passenger do not include the right to have other passengers removed because of their race. That's not how airlines work. That's not how federal law works, and that's certainly not how human decency works." The moral wall that Maria had constructed was now complete and impenetrable. She had transformed the situation from difficult passenger versus airline crew into professional standards versus discrimination. And in doing so, She had given everyone in that cabin a clear choice about which side of history they wanted to be on. Captain Sullivan's face was now pale as he began to understand the full implications of what was happening. A senior crew member was publicly accusing him of ordering discriminatory actions. Passengers were watching every moment of this confrontation. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he was beginning to realize that this incident could end his career. But the most important transformation was happening in Julian himself. He was witnessing ordinary courage in action, seeing someone risk their livelihood to protect his dignity, and he was about to show them all that sometimes moral courage gets rewarded in the most unexpected ways.
That's when Julian finally spoke up, and the words that came out of his mouth would send shockwaves through the entire aviation industry. Julian had remained silent throughout Maria's courageous defense, watching with quiet appreciation as she dismantled Rick's discriminatory demands with professional precision and moral authority. But now, as Captain Sullivan stood frozen between his poor decision and Maria's policy citations, Julian decided it was time to end the charade once and for all. He rose from his seat with the calm dignity of someone who had never doubted his right to be exactly where he was, his movement causing the entire first-class cabin to fall into an expectant silence. When Julian spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone who was used to making decisions that affected thousands of people and millions of dollars. "Captain Sullivan," Julian began, his tone respectful but cutting through the tension like a laser beam. "I'm sure you're eager to get this flight in the air. After all, the on-time performance metrics are a key component of the new Project Ascension software suite we are about to install for you." The words hit Captain Sullivan like a physical blow. His face went from embarrassed red to shocked white in an instant as his mind raced to process what he had just heard. Project Ascension wasn't public knowledge. It was a top-secret, multi-million-dollar technology upgrade that represented Atlantic Airways' most important operational advancement in decades. Only the highest levels of corporate leadership knew about the project's details and timeline. "Project Ascension?" Captain Sullivan stammered, his voice cracking like a teenager's. "How do you know about that? That's a top-level corporate deal that hasn't even been announced to crew management yet." Julian looked directly at the captain, then shifted his gaze to Rick Preston, whose smug expression was beginning to show the first cracks of uncertainty. When Julian spoke again, his words would change everything for everyone in that cabin. "I know about Project Ascension because my company, Zenith Dynamics, is the one developing it for you. Or rather, we were developing it. My name is Julian Vance." The silence that followed was so complete it seemed to vacuum all sound from the aircraft. Captain Sullivan's mouth fell open as if his jaw had become disconnected from his skull. Rick Preston's face went through a spectrum of colors, from confident pink to confused pale to horrified gray as the implications of Julian's identity began to sink in. But Julian wasn't finished. He had spent the last 20 minutes being treated like a second-class citizen by people who had no idea they were discriminating against their airline's most valuable business partner, and he was about to make sure they understood exactly what their prejudice had cost them. "Captain, let me help you understand the situation," Julian continued, his voice maintaining the same calm professionalism he used in boardroom presentations that decided the fate of billion-dollar companies. "Zenith Dynamics provides the navigation software, flight management systems, and passenger safety protocols for your entire fleet. We also maintain the ground-based support systems that keep your planes on schedule and in the air safely."
Captain Sullivan felt his knees go weak as he realized he was listening to the man whose technology literally kept Atlantic Airways operational. Every flight he had ever piloted had relied on Julian's company's innovations. Every on-time departure he had achieved had been made possible by Zenith Dynamics software. Every safety protocol that protected his passengers had been developed by the man he had just ordered to be moved to accommodate a racist passenger. Rick Preston's confident demeanor had completely evaporated, replaced by the dawning horror of someone who realized he had just publicly humiliated one of the most powerful people in the aviation industry. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly as he tried to process the magnitude of his mistake. But perhaps the most significant reaction came from Maria, whose eyes widened with a mixture of vindication and amazement. She had risked her career to defend a passenger's dignity, not knowing she was protecting someone whose business relationships could make or break airlines. Her moral courage had just been validated in the most spectacular way possible. Other passengers in first class began murmuring among themselves as they realized they had just witnessed the most expensive case of discrimination in aviation history. The quiet man in the simple sweater, whom Rick had dismissed as unworthy of first-class treatment, was actually the person responsible for keeping commercial aviation safe and efficient. Julian reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, the same device he had used earlier to document the discrimination and activate the Nightingale Protocol. But now he was going to use it to demonstrate just how much power Rick Preston had chosen to attack. "Captain, would you like me to call Dr. Patricia Chen, my chief of staff, so she can explain to you exactly what the suspension of our partnership negotiations means for Atlantic Airways' operational future?" Julian asked, his question carrying the weight of someone offering to demonstrate the scope of a catastrophe. The cabin remained frozen in stunned silence as everyone present began to understand that they had just witnessed discrimination against someone who could literally ground their entire airline with a single phone call. Rick's racist demands had just cost Atlantic Airways the most important business relationship in their corporate history. Julian looked directly at Rick Preston, his gaze steady and unforgiving. "For the record, Mr. Preston, my company's corporate travel account alone is worth $8 million annually to this airline, but that's nothing compared to the $150 million Project Ascension contract that your behavior has just placed in serious jeopardy." The revelation was complete, but the consequences were just beginning.
What happened next proved that sometimes justice comes not just swiftly, but with the precision of a master strategist who had been planning for exactly this moment. The first-class cabin remained locked in stunned silence as the full weight of Julian's revelation settled over everyone like a heavy blanket. Captain Sullivan stood frozen in the aisle, his 20 years of aviation experience providing absolutely no guidance for how to handle the fact that he had just publicly humiliated his airline's most critical business partner. His mind raced through the implications, and every scenario he could imagine ended with his career in ruins. But the most dramatic transformation was happening to Rick Preston, whose confident racism had evaporated so completely that he looked like a deflated balloon. The smug expression that had defined his face for the past 30 minutes had collapsed into something resembling pure terror as he began to understand the magnitude of what he had done. This wasn't just about being embarrassed on a flight anymore. This was about being personally responsible for potentially destroying his own company's relationship with one of the most powerful figures in the aerospace industry. Julian looked directly at Rick with the cold precision of someone who had spent decades making calculated business decisions. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of someone who was about to demonstrate exactly what happened when you targeted the wrong person with your prejudice. "Mr. Preston," Julian said, his voice maintaining the same calm professionalism that had made him one of the most respected CEOs in the technology sector, "I want you to understand something very clearly. For the record, my company's corporate travel account with Atlantic Airways is worth $8 million annually. That represents thousands of flights for our employees, executives, and consultants who travel around the world implementing our aerospace solutions. Rick's face went from gray to green as he realized that Julian wasn't just talking about personal revenge, he was talking about business consequences that would ripple through the entire aviation industry. $8 million in annual travel represented more revenue than many small airlines generated in an entire year. But Julian wasn't finished delivering his calculated response to the discrimination he had endured. He turned his attention to Captain Sullivan, whose career was hanging by a thread that was getting thinner with every word. "Captain Sullivan, I want you to call your corporate headquarters immediately and inform them that the $150 million Project Ascension contract is now on indefinite hold pending a complete review of Atlantic Airways passenger treatment policies and staff training procedures." The impact of those words was like a financial earthquake that sent shockwaves through everyone who understood what they meant. Project Ascension wasn't just another technology upgrade. It represented the future of Atlantic Airways' competitive advantage, their ability to offer more efficient flights, better passenger experiences, and safer operations than their competitors. Captain Sullivan felt his legs go weak as he realized that his snap judgment to avoid a minor delay had just cost his airline the most important contract in their corporate history. The bonuses tied to on-time performance that had motivated his decision suddenly seemed laughably insignificant compared to the $150 million that was now in jeopardy because of his failure to stand up to a racist passenger.
Maria Gonzalez, who had risked her career to defend Julian's dignity, felt a surge of vindication and amazement as she watched justice unfold before her eyes. Her years of experience told her that she was witnessing something unprecedented, a passenger who had been discriminated against, revealing himself to be powerful enough to hold an entire airline accountable for their actions. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came when Julian's phone rang and he answered it on speaker so everyone in the cabin could hear the conversation that would change everything. "Mr. Vance, this is Dr. Patricia Chen. I've been monitoring the situation as per Nightingale protocol, and I have the Atlantic Airways CEO, Margaret Thompson, on a conference call. She's requesting an immediate conversation with you." The voice that came through Julian's phone next was that of a woman in full crisis management mode, speaking with the desperate urgency of someone who had just learned that her company's future was hanging in the balance. "Mr. Vance, this is Margaret Thompson, CEO of Atlantic Airways. I am calling to personally apologize for the completely unacceptable treatment you have received on Flight 815. We are implementing immediate corrective actions, and I would like to discuss how we can resolve this situation and preserve our critical partnership." The irony was almost too perfect to believe. The CEO of Atlantic Airways was now begging forgiveness from the man her own captain had ordered to be moved to accommodate a racist passenger. The discrimination that had started with Rick's demand to have Julian removed from first class had escalated into a corporate crisis that threatened the airline's technological future. Julian looked around the cabin at the faces staring at him in amazement and fear. Rick Preston looked like he wanted to disappear into his seat. Captain Sullivan appeared to be calculating whether his pension would survive the termination that was surely coming. Chloe stood frozen in the aisle, finally understanding that her willingness to accommodate discrimination had nearly cost her employer hundreds of millions of dollars. But when Julian spoke to the CEO on the phone, his response revealed the strategic mind that had built a technology empire and the moral character that demanded accountability for discrimination. "Ms. Thompson, I appreciate your call, but apologies are not enough. This incident has revealed systematic failures in your staff training, your discrimination policies, and your leadership's ability to protect passengers' civil rights.
before Zenith Dynamics considers continuing any business relationship with Atlantic Airways, you will implement a comprehensive anti-bias training program for all employees, from baggage handlers to executives. The consequences were swift, decisive, and perfectly calibrated to ensure that this kind of discrimination would never happen again on an Atlantic Airways flight.
But what happened over the following weeks would prove that sometimes one moment of exposed discrimination can transform an entire industry forever. Before Flight 815 even had a chance to taxi away from the gate, the consequences of that 30-minute confrontation in first class were already reshaping Atlantic Airways from the top down. Within hours of Julian's phone conversation with CEO Margaret Thompson, emergency board meetings were being called, crisis management teams were being assembled, and corporate policies that had been in place for decades were being completely rewritten. The first and most immediate consequence was the swift and decisive action taken against those who had enabled the discrimination. Rick Preston, whose racist demands had triggered the entire incident, discovered that his problems extended far beyond a single airline when he landed. Atlantic Airways security was waiting for him at the gate, not just to escort him from the airport, but to officially serve him with a lifetime ban from the airline. But that was only the beginning of his troubles. Word of Rick's behavior had somehow reached his own employer before his plane touched down, and his company's executives were horrified to learn that their sales representative had created a public relations nightmare involving one of the aerospace industry's most influential figures. Rick Preston's career in aviation sales ended the same day his discrimination began, as his company terminated him immediately to distance themselves from the scandal. Captain Sullivan's fate was equally swift and final. His 20-year career with Atlantic Airways came to an abrupt end when the airline's investigation revealed that his decision to validate discriminatory demands violated not just company policy, but federal civil rights regulations that governed commercial aviation. The captain, who had prioritized schedule over dignity, found himself permanently grounded, his pilot's license under review by federal authorities who took discrimination in commercial aviation very seriously. Chloe, the young flight attendant whose inexperience had nearly cost her employer hundreds of millions of dollars, was placed on immediate administrative leave. However, her consequences carried a different message than the others. Because she had been intimidated into poor decisions rather than actively promoting discrimination, Atlantic Airways offered her a choice: termination or participation in an intensive retraining program that would teach her how to recognize and resist discriminatory demands from passengers. But the most remarkable transformation happened to Maria, whose moral courage had created the turning point in the entire confrontation. Not only was she publicly commended by Atlantic Airways leadership, but she was promoted to Senior Training Supervisor for the airline's new Passenger Dignity Initiative. Her willingness to risk her job to defend a passenger's rights had earned her the opportunity to train thousands of airline employees to do the same thing. The changes at Atlantic Airways went far beyond individual consequences. Julian's demand for comprehensive anti-bias training resulted in the most extensive passenger rights program in commercial aviation history. Every employee, from baggage handlers to executives, was required to complete 40 hours of intensive training designed by Zenith Dynamics Consulting Division. The program covered not just discrimination recognition, but conflict de-escalation, passenger advocacy, and the legal consequences of enabling prejudice. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation was the implementation of what became known as the Vance Protocol, a passenger advocacy system that allowed any airline employee to escalate discriminatory incidents immediately to senior management. The system included whistleblower protections, mandatory investigation procedures, and severe penalties for any supervisor who retaliated against employees who reported discrimination.
The ripple effects extended far beyond Atlantic Airways as other airlines watched the crisis unfold and realized they needed to examine their own policies before they faced similar scandals. Within 6 months, 12 major airlines had implemented passenger dignity training programs, and the Federal Aviation Administration had announced new regulations requiring anti-discrimination training for all commercial aviation personnel. Julian's decision to make his experience public through a carefully released statement had created a watershed moment for the entire travel industry. His account of the incident, backed by the smartphone recordings he had made during the confrontation, went viral within hours and generated millions of views, shares, and comments from people sharing their own experiences with travel discrimination. The business consequences were equally transformative. Atlantic Airways not only retained their relationship with Zenith Dynamics, but the partnership actually strengthened as Julian worked with them to develop innovative passenger advocacy technologies. Project Ascension was not only reinstated, but expanded to include advanced monitoring systems that could detect and prevent discriminatory incidents before they escalated. The financial impact of Julian's experience created a new business reality where discrimination was recognized as an expensive liability that airlines could no longer afford to ignore. Insurance companies began requiring passenger rights training as a condition of coverage, and corporate travel accounts started including anti-discrimination clauses in their contracts with airlines. 6 months after Flight 815, Julian received an invitation to speak at the International Aviation Summit about the importance of dignity in air travel. As he stood at the podium looking out at an audience of airline executives, pilot unions, and flight attendant associations, he reflected on how a simple flight to a business meeting had become a catalyst for industry-wide transformation. What happened on Flight 815 wasn't just about one passenger or one airline, Julian told the audience. It was about whether the aviation industry would continue to enable discrimination or whether we would choose to make air travel safe and dignified for everyone, regardless of their race, appearance, or background. The final image of this remarkable story took place exactly 1 year later, when Julian boarded another Atlantic Airways flight for a business trip. This time, he was personally greeted by Maria Gonzalez, now the airline's Director of Passenger Experience, who had implemented training programs that were being adopted by airlines around the world. As Julian settled into his first-class seat, he smiled knowing that his experience had not just ended discrimination for him, but had created systems and policies that would protect countless future passengers from experiencing the humiliation he had endured. Sometimes the most powerful changes come not from accepting injustice, but from having the courage and resources to fight it in ways that create lasting transformation. The flight departed on time, with dignity intact for every passenger on board, proving that when discrimination is met with consequence and justice is backed by systemic change, the sky truly becomes the limit for what's possible.
Julian's story proves that discrimination isn't just morally wrong, it's catastrophically expensive. He could have used his CEO status to demand VIP treatment from the start, but by experiencing bias firsthand, he exposed a system that judges passengers by appearance rather than character. The real lesson? Sometimes the person you underestimate controls your entire future. Maria's courage to defend a stranger saved her career, while Rick's racism destroyed his. Captain Sullivan learned that enabling prejudice costs more than any delay ever could. When discrimination meets consequence, industries transform. Julian didn't just win justice for himself, he created protections for every passenger who'll never face what he endured. Hit like if you believe respect shouldn't depend on appearance. Comment your own travel discrimination stories, and subscribe for more incredible reversals where karma delivers the ultimate justice. Trust us, you've never seen plot twists like these.